So again, maybe the senator from Utah ought to learn a little bit more about how business has been done in the Congress of the United States. Budget resolutions are not signed by the President of the United States, so even if we did vote to increase the debt limit as a result of the conference, which, by the way, would be irrelevant to the work of the conference, then it wouldn't have any meaning whatsoever. And again, this business of secret backroom deal-making, that's what conferences are about, and conference results are subject to a vote of both houses as to the conference result.
Well, Senator, yield for a question.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Senator, I have conferred with our budget chair while you were debating this with the senator from Utah, and maybe they're not aware that the conference committees are open to anyone who wants to observe them. So I would like, through you, to invite the senator from Utah to sit in on the conference committee and listen to every word. This notion that our democracy is a backroom deal because a bill's in conference, the founding fathers are shaking their head in disgust at this notion. Well, it is not a closed process. It's an open process. Anybody can come and listen.
And it is my understanding, since the budget conference is open to the public, it will also be broadcast on C-SPAN so that all the American people can watch what the deliberations are. So I wonder, why would the senator from Utah say it's a backroom, closed-door deal when the fact, doesn't the senator from Utah know that this is open to the public and seen by everybody, the conferences? I mean, this is, for him to say it's a backroom, closed-door deal, either is directly misleading or no knowledge of how the budget conference works. I don't know which one it is, and I don't know which one is worse. So all I can say is that we know, one, that even if we had a restriction on raising in the budget of the debt limit, even if we and it would not matter because it's not legislation that would be signed by the President of the United States, no matter what the budget conferees did. And we also know that the budget conferees, unlike many, I will admit, but budget conferees meet in open session with C-SPAN and the American people able to observe it. So I at least hope that the senator from Utah would withdraw his comment that this is a backroom, closed-door deal, because it isn't. It isn't. Those are fundamental facts.
Mr. President.
So, it's really disappointing that we are spending this time when we should be on the Farm Bill. The senator from California and I have an important amendment to remove a lot of the corruption that's in that bill. And so I would go ahead and yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
As to the suggestion that this produces a budget resolution that at the end of the day does not go to the President and isn't law, technically on its own face that's accurate. What we're concerned about here are the instructions that would accompany the conference report, instructions that would allow the normal rules of the Senate to be circumvented, specifically for something like this, for a piece of legislation that would itself raise the debt limit to be considered.
Yield for a question.
Just let me finish what I'm saying. To be voted on a 51-vote margin rather than on a 60-vote margin. And so this is different. And regardless of how open you make that conference meeting, it is not the same kind of open debate in which every senator, every representative is able to participate in the same way that they would be able to on the floor.
Does the senator admit that it's not a closed-door deal behind the closed doors? Does he admit that? Does he admit that he misspoke on that issue? It's not behind closed doors.
Look, compared to the way we do things on the floor, this is a closed-door deal. And compared to the way we do things on the floor, this is not subject to the same kind of scrutiny. The fact is that we have rules in the Senate, rules that on something like this would allow us to proceed on the basis of a 60-vote threshold. That's the whole purpose of this discussion. That's the basis of our concern, is that we don't want legislation that can run through to raise the debt limit, incurring additional potentially trillions of dollars in borrowing authority on the basis of only a 51-vote threshold. That's our concern.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have been listening to this debate not just now but for 61 days as we have been working extremely hard to get the budget passed and then go to conference to work with our House colleagues who, by the way, are majority Republicans. And we are working to do that because the American people have been very loud about not managing by crisis. And we all know that what will happen if we don't go to conference is exactly what the senator from Utah has been saying he doesn't want. If we go to conference, we will have an open conference committee to discuss the differences between the House and the Senate budgets that will then give the instructions to conference on how to move forward on our appropriations bills that we are now looking at and how we're going to deal with sequestration. It will be an open debate that will come back here. But if we are not allowed to go to conference, what will happen, because we do have to pass our appropriations and spending bills or move to a continuing resolution because we can't if we don't get a budget deal, we're going to have closed-door discussions, secret discussions to figure out a way what we're going to do when that debt ceiling hits, and it will come down on you in the middle of the night, and you won't have had an opportunity to be a part of it because of the delay that is occurring right now. If the Senate allows us to go to conference, members of the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, my counterpart Senator Sessions and I and his committee, as well as Congressman Ryan from a Republican Party in the House and his committee members and Democrats will sit together in an open process and determine how we move our budget forward.
For a question?
I'd be happy to.
In case of the appointment of conferees, will you have it open to the public and C-SPAN or any other media coverage that would like to come in the room?
Well, once the conference is set and we begin to meet as a conference, it is like any other committee hearing where absolutely the public will be able to come in and listen. They will be able to watch on C-SPAN. It will be an open process. But I would tell the senator from Arizona that if we don't get to conference, we are going to have discussions as a country about how we manage our finances and our government moving forward, and those will be behind closed doors. So what the senator is objecting is because of closed-door secret meetings he is causing. So I would really hope that our Republican colleagues would allow us to move forward. As the senator from Missouri said, we had 50 hours of debate. We had over 100 amendments that were considered. Not one amendment was offered or considered on the debt ceiling, which is now what they're objecting that we go to conference to. And we had an ability, in fact, the senator from Texas, I believe, offered 17 amendments, and he's been objecting because of this. Not one of them about the debt ceiling. I know the senator wants to have a debt ceiling debate here on the floor of the Senate. He is welcome to come to the floor of the Senate any time and talk about the debt ceiling. We welcome that discussion. We believe that our bills should be paid. That's separate from what we're talking about here. We're talking about a budget resolution. I would be happy to use.
How many amendments were considered?
There were over 100 amendments considered. There was 50 hours of debate, equally divided. Every senator participated.
And how many were voted on?
70 were. Over 70 were agreed to.
But there was not one amendment on the debt ceiling.
Not one amendment was offered or considered on the debt ceiling.
I thank the senator.
And I would add that what the senator from Missouri has offered, after talking with the senator from Arizona, is the ability now to have a vote on that, despite there wasn't any during that, to offer with our consent that, yes, okay, fine, if you have to have that now, we want to get to conference, we will allow a vote on that, and proceed to the budget. So I do not understand this argument that we are going into some secret meeting. I assure the senator that we have seen secret meetings here when it comes to the budget in the past that have gotten us all to a very frustrating point. Let's move to conference so we do not have those secret meetings. You are arguing for something, I would say to the senator from Utah, that you are going to cause. So I would really hope that we can come to an agreement on this. We've offered a consent that offers 2 amendments to be considered. We hope to have those. We hope to go to conference. I assure you that we will be as open and as transparent as possible. That budget resolution will come back to the Senate Everyone will have a chance to have their say if they want that, and then that budget resolution will give us our instructions so we can continue to move forward on regular order to fund the Defense Department, to fund agriculture, to fund education, to fund the different aspects of government, transportation and housing. That is our obligation to do as the United States Congress in order for the American public to be able to manage what we are doing, what they are required to do once we pass our budget. So I would really urge our Republican colleagues to back off on their insistence on this. I am ready to go to conference. Am I going to like what comes out of conference? As chair of the Budget Committee that worked really hard to get a budget passed here in the Senate? Probably not. But I know my responsibility as a United States Senator is to work with my House Republican colleagues and those on our conference committee to come to the best judgment we can mutually to move our country forward and to get us out of this management by crisis that is forced on us time and time again over the last several years. The American people deserve certainty. That certainty will come when we can move to conference with an open, transparent committee process that allows us to get the budget in order. And I urge our colleagues to reconsider their objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too want the Senate to move to negotiating with the House on the budget. I think it's critically important. And let me say I have tremendous respect for the legislative process in our republic at the state level, local level, the federal level. And in fact, my colleagues are correct. Oftentimes in this place, we have to vote for things that we don't like because it's a product of compromise. It may not have everything we want, but it gives us the things that we need. I certainly have been on the losing end of multiple votes in this place during the time I've been here because I'm in the minority, both in party and sometimes in view. And so I certainly understand that part of it. And that's why I voted against the budget. I'm glad we finally produced a budget after 1,000 days, but I would say to you that that budget is one that I think is deficient, and that's why I voted against the budget. Nevertheless, I believe that this institution should move forward in negotiating the differences between our budget and the budget that the House has so that we can finally have a budget in this country and so this country can move forward. The only thing that I'm asking for, the only thing my colleagues are asking for, is that as part of that negotiation, if I may finish my statement and I'll entertain any questions you may have, that as part of that negotiation, that the issue of the debt limit not be included. Now, I've heard here today statements made that there were X number of amendments filed and they didn't include the debt limit. I think the reason is because most of us agreed that that was an issue that needed to be dealt with on its own. This is not just some issue. It's an extremely consequential issue, one that needs to be debated in and of itself because it is the function not just of an annual budget. The massive debt that our country faces is a function of a structural problem that we have. We basically have these massive government programs that are going bankrupt, and if we don't deal with it, it just keeps getting worse. I've also heard statements made here today that, well, you know, we can't raise the debt limit even if we wanted to because of the way it's structured. And that's why I'm puzzled. Why then the objection? Why then the objection to a very simple notion, and that is we can be in conference today with the House. We can be negotiating with the House this very moment if all we do is just say, look, go ahead, negotiate the differences with the budget, negotiate taxes. If it has a tax increase, I'm voting against it, but negotiate that, negotiate all these sorts of things. But the debt limit cannot be part of it. It has to be dealt with separately. And I just don't understand the objection to that being in there. I would say one more thing about this thing and the amendments. And a cautionary tale there, the next time someone comes up to you and says, don't file any more amendments, you're slowing the place down, maybe you should file them, because if you don't file them, you've got to hold your peace forever. So, but that being the case, look, I think we need to move to a negotiation with the House with a very simple language in it that it should not have a debt limit increase. And so I am going to move and ask for unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, House Concurrent Resolution 25, that the amendment which is at the desk, the text of Senate Concurrent Resolution 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, and that House Concurrent Resolution 25, as amended, be agreed to. The motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendments, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and that the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, all with no intervening action or debate. Further, that a conference report in relation to House Concurrent Resolution 25 not be in order in the Senate that includes reconciliation instructions to increase the debt ceiling.
Is there objection?
Object.
The objection is heard.
Well, then we're in the same place we were before. Basically, this was Senatees. What I basically said is, I want the Senate to go into negotiations with the House. And the only thing we ask is that when they come back, there not be reconciliation instructions in there that the debt limit be dealt with or increased, because the debt limit is so consequential for our country that it needs to be dealt with on its own. And let me remind everybody of what we're dealing with here. Let me tell you, this is a bipartisan debt. I said this yesterday, I'll repeat it today. This is a debt that grew over the last 20 or 30 years with the cooperation of both parties, unfortunately, although we've never seen anything like the last 5 years. It is a function of a structural problem in our spending programs. If we don't deal with those programs, it is going to collapse our economy within our lifetime and certainly with that of our children. It is time to deal with it now. That issue should be debated on its own, not as part of a budget negotiation that deals with a one-year spending agreement.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, we've been through this quite a bit, but again, I would respond by saying that if it were part of the budget resolution, it would have no effect in law. So one has to then question what the knowledge of those who are advocating this is about the fundamental procedures. Second of all, if this is a prerequisite, then every conference that we send, then senators will be allowed, if, according to this President, to set certain parameters of those conferences, which is a procedure we use now instructions to conferees. We are willing to have votes on instructions to conferees on any issue that any senator feels necessary for the conferees to do their job.
Will the senator yield for a question?
I'll be glad to.
Senator, the Senate is a wondrous creation by our founding fathers in that a great deal of power was given to the minority in the Senate. And I know that you've enjoyed having that power from time to time, and I'm sure when my party has been in the minority, it has been important that, and we have respected that in this body. Although there have been some really dicey times, and I'm aware that you have been involved when we were on the brink of blowing up the rights of the minority, I want to make sure I understand. The way I really see what's going on here is we now have a super minority. If this were allowed to pass, what we would be doing is changing what the founding fathers had in mind in terms of the power of the minority and actually saying, let's go back in history and say there were 1 or 2 or 3 senators or 4 senators that decided, by gosh, they weren't going to do voting rights legislation, or they weren't going to do the vote for women, or they weren't going to do some of the changes that have occurred in our country. Do you see a problem that if we allow a super minority, a minority of the minority, to hijack a process laid out in our Constitution, that what would happen is the majority would have no choice at that point than to begin to circumscribe the rules for the minority?
Well, I think that's a danger, and I think it's a significant danger if a number of senators know either how large or small should insist that certain conditions be imposed unilaterally without motions to instruct. That's what we have motions to instruct for. It's not that we don't want the conferees to do certain things, but we have motions to instruct. That's the regular order of how we do business. And the senators here who say that the debt ceiling should not be part of any negotiations, fine. Let's have a vote, motions to instruct the conferees. And it's been my experience that the conferees have stuck with the instructions that were voted on by the majority of the United States Senate. So this is just kind of a sad time, because here we are debating as to whether we should allow the debt limit to be part of negotiations, which would have no meaning in law whatsoever because it's not signed by the President. And there are pressing issues. The senator from California and I have an issue that has to do with tobacco and the health of our kids that we'd like to have considered before the United States Senate. We could be debating on the instructions to the conferees. We could be doing so many things, and we're not. And we're not doing those things. And finally, I would again share my experience with my colleagues. I have lost a lot more times than I have won. But I've come to the floor of the Senate using the rules of the Senate and made the argument on those things I believe in and stand for. And I've been passionate on those issues, and sometimes I've irritated my colleagues, but at least I've had my say. But then after I've had my say, there have been votes, and the body has decided. And the body has decided whether I was right or wrong, and when I've been voted down, I've gone back on those issues, and I've tried to convince my colleagues of the rightness of my position, rather than, like with the gun bill, after people are slaughtered in Newton, Connecticut, and my colleagues didn't even want to debate the issue of gun control or whether what we should do about that. That's not how the Senate should function. The Senate is supposed to debate and discuss and give our passionate appeals and beliefs, and then put it to the will of the body. That's the protection of the individual senator, not to just say, we're not going to do anything. That's not the way the American people want us to act. And to throw in all this stuff about the debt and the deficit, I'll match my record on opposing the debt and the deficit against certainly my colleagues here. But that's not the point. The point is, will this deliberative body, whether it's the greatest in the world or not, or the worst in the world, go ahead and decide on this issue so that we can have a budget, so we can at least tell the American people that we are going to do what we haven't done for 4 years and that every family in America sooner or later has to do, and that is to have a budget. So, as I say, we've gone on too long. The Farm Bill is of the utmost importance, and the Senator from California and I have amendments on it, but I hope my colleagues will realize that the best way to get their point of view over and sway the opinion of our colleagues and the American people is to engage in honest and open debate, and as the Senate does, instruct the conferees, let them go to conference, in an open, not closed door, not behind closed doors, not backroom process that is the procedure employed by the Budget Committee in conference. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, in Gulliver's Travels, Swift told us of two fictional lands, Lilliput and Blefuscu, that had been at war for years over which end of the egg to open first. In Lilliput, they opened the big egg, and in Blefuscu, they opened the small end of the egg. And the big enders and little enders battled endlessly. I am sorry to say that that satirical depiction often reflects what occurs in this august body. We spend a great deal of time arguing about procedural niceties, about motions to commit or not to commit that do not matter to the American people. And all the meantime, we are bankrupting our children and our grandchildren. If I could, I'd like to cut through all of the arguments back and forth, because in my view, most of the arguments are, by design, missing the point of this disagreement. This disagreement is over one issue and one issue only. Can the United States Senate raise our debt limit with only 50 votes, or does it take 60? Everything else that's being talked about is smoke. It is a side issue. The central fight here is, should the United States Senate be able to raise the debt limit with 50 votes or 60. Now, I will note my friend from Arizona questioned the knowledge of those who are objecting, and he suggested that perhaps our knowledge was lacking because this could not be done. Well, I know my friend from Arizona is a long veteran of this body, and he surely knows that in 1987 and 1990 it was done. This is not a hypothetical. And in 1995 and 2004, it was attempted. It didn't quite get accomplished, but it was attempted. And what occurs under the Budget Act of 1974 is that when a conference report is adopted and reconciliation instructions are sent that raise the debt ceiling, that can then be passed by this body with merely 50 votes. This is all an avenue to allow a debt ceiling increase to be raised with 50 votes. And I know my friend from Arizona is well aware of that because he is such an esteemed historian of this body that he knows not only can it be done, but it has been done. And we don't need to hypothesize over whether that's what this is about, because for 62 days, we have asked the majority leader, simply say, we won't use this as a procedural trick to raise the debt ceiling with 50 votes, and we can go to conference. And for 62 days, the majority leader has said, no, no, I will not do that, I will not do that. And those protestations make absolutely clear what this is about. Mr. President, I think on both sides of the chambers, there are different things at work. On the Democratic side of the chamber, President Obama has been very explicit. He wants to raise the debt limit, and he has said he wants no debate about it. He's unwilling to debate. He wants to shut down the discussion. He simply wants a blank check. He simply wants an unlimited credit card to keep digging the debt hole this nation is in deeper and deeper and deeper. And he said this publicly, repeatedly from the White House. And what our friends, the Democrats, are doing is standing shoulder to shoulder with the Democrat president in fighting to enable the United States Senate to raise the debt limit with just 50 votes, which means, if that happens, that would then allow the 55-member Democratic majority to vote to do so without listening to a word from the minority. That's what this fight is about. There's no other issue being contested here. But what's happening on the Republican side? Well, some have suggested we ought to just have a motion to instruct. Now, the problem with a motion to instruct is a motion to instruct is non-binding, so it's a purely symbolic gesture. But even a motion to instruct not to raise the debt ceiling would lose. Why? Because there are 55 Democrats, and the 55 Democrats would vote against it. And here's the dirty little secret about some of those on the right side of the aisle. There are some who very much like to cast a symbolic vote against raising the debt ceiling, and nonetheless to allow our friends on the left side of the aisle to raise the debt ceiling. That, to some Republicans, is the ideal outcome, because they can go to their constituents and say, see, I voted no, and yet at the same time, wonderfully, they lost, and they didn't actually have to stand up and stop what was happening. And so that is an outcome I believe that there are some on this side of the aisle who desire. Now, I do feel obliged to rise in defense of my colleagues, the Republicans, because the senior senator from Arizona has impugned the Republicans by claiming repeatedly that it is only a minority of Republicans who are opposed to raising the debt ceiling on just 50 votes. And he has repeatedly suggested on the floor of the Senate that, in fact, it may be a small minority, that the overwhelming majority of Republicans, the senior senator from Arizona said, stand with Harry Reid in wanting to be able to raise the debt ceiling on 50 votes. Let me suggest to the senior senator from Arizona that, number one, in saying that, he is impugning all 45 Republicans in this body. But number two, it has been suggested that those of us who are fighting to defend liberty, fighting to turn around the out-of-control spending and out-of-control debt in this country, fighting to defend the Constitution, it has been suggested that we are wacko birds. Well, if that is the case, I will suggest to my friend from Arizona, there may be more wacko birds in the Senate than is suspected. Indeed, I would encourage my friend, the senior senator from Arizona, that if he were to circulate to Republicans a simple statement that said, we, the undersigned Republican senators, hereby state that we support giving Harry Reid and the Democrats the ability to raise the debt ceiling with 50 votes instead of 60. I believe he will find that his representation to this body, that it is only a minority of Republicans that oppose that, is not accurate. This issue gets obscured by the procedural complexities, and that's not by accident. Washington is very good at speaking doublespeak that make the citizens' eyes glaze over. But at its heart, it's very, very simple. Majority Leader Reid and the Democrats want to raise the debt ceiling. They have stated they want to raise the debt ceiling, and they want to do so consistent with President Obama's instructions to do so without debate, because he doesn't want to debate this issue, without conditions, without anything to fix our out-of-control spending, our out-of-control debt. Simply give him an additional blank credit card, because going from $10 trillion to $17 trillion has not been enough. That is the desire of the Democrats, and it is candid. We could go to conference right now today if the Democrats would simply say, we won't raise the debt ceiling with just using 50 votes. We will debate it on the floor with a 60-vote threshold and actually be forced to find some bipartisan agreement. But that's not what the majority wants to do. And those who are arguing that Republicans should accede to that demand are arguing that all of us who have told our constituents we're going to fight to solve this economic problem, we're going to fight to stop this out-of-control spending, we're going to fight to stop bankrupting our kids, that those promises are hollow. Those are just what we tell constituents at home. That's not actually what we do when we're on the floor of the Senate. I would note, indeed, that when the senior senator from Arizona said it is only a small minority that believes this on the Republican side, if my friend the senior senator is able to produce a written letter with the signature of a majority of Republicans, I will offer here and now to go to a home game of my Houston Astros wearing an Arizona Diamondback hat. And I can guarantee you in Houston that will not be well received, but yet I stand in complete comfort that I will not find myself in that situation, because I don't believe it's right that a majority of the Republicans in this body have given up the fight on spending, have given up the fight on reining in out-of-control, Washington, bipartisan spending, deficits, and debt. I believe we are seeing leadership in this body stand together to fix the problem. That is what the American people want. So let me say this in closing. It's easy to get confused by all of the procedural discussions back and forth. This issue is about one issue alone. Should Majority Leader Harry Reid be able to raise the debt limit, an unlimited amount, with just 50 votes? Or should it require 60? If it requires 60, there will have to be some positive steps made to fix the problem. If it's just 50, the Majority Leader has the votes right now today to write a blank check for the federal debt. That's the issue, and I think the American people are not conflicted in the answer to that issue. The American people want us to fix the problem and stop digging the debt hole deeper and deeper, stop putting our kids and grandkids on the path to Greece. And I am proud that so many senators are standing here working very hard to honor our commitments to our constituents, because that's exactly what our job is. I yield the floor.
Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I thank my friend and my colleague, the senator from Texas, for his remarks, and I speak briefly just to respond to a couple of points that have come up today. First of all, it's important for us to remember that although the rules of our body might allow for a conference committee to meet in public, and although that may have happened in the past from time to time, it's not the norm. In asking around to some senior staff members who have been here longer than I have, it typically hasn't happened in recent years. In fact, it's become relatively rare in recent years. So to suggest that it necessarily is an open process because it has the capacity to be made into an open process, those are not the same things. And typically, we can legitimately expect for this to be a backroom, closed-door process. Now, that's not the end of the world. We, of course, need conference committees. They do valuable, important work. We're not disputing that. We're not disputing the fact that sometimes it's important for conference committees to meet in order to attempt to reconcile competing versions of the same legislation, one passed in the House and one passed in the Senate. But what we're talking about here is a very limited request to limit the scope of their work so as to exclude the possibility of a debt limit increase without the 60-vote threshold. It's also important to remember that although this is the procedure that the majority has chosen to use in order to try to get to a conference committee, it's not the only way. In fact, it's possible to do this without unanimous consent. It's possible to do this without, in other words, all of us being willing to do it, all of us, by withholding our objection, as effectively voting to do that. If, as has been suggested, the other body does in fact want to go to conference, the other body could take the budget that we passed, could slap their amendments on top of it, could even replace most or even all of our budget with theirs, send it back over, and at that point, it's my understanding, we could go to conference without the need for a unanimous consent. So there are other ways. This is just the way that the majority has chosen to go. The majority has every right to do that, and we have every right to object. That we do, and that we will continue to do until such time as it either becomes unnecessary or until such time as the majority agrees to modify the request along the lines that we've specified, so as to permit and ensure that any debt limit discussions and votes will take place subsequent to the normal order and subject to a 60-vote threshold. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, Madam President, excuse me.
The senator from California.
Thank you, Madam President. I believe pursuant to a unanimous consent agreement by the chairman of the Agriculture Committee that I am next up to be able to speak on an amendment. But for just a brief moment, Madam President, I want to reflect on what I've heard and the lens through which I see it. I've been here for 20 years. When I came to the Senate, it was not this way. The rules of the Senate were observed. A small minority never tried to subvert the will of the majority. I think Senator McCain said it well. We stand on the floor, we advocate for our views, we either win or lose, the die is cost. But we have an opportunity for full deliberation. It's one thing to have a minority have their rights. It's another thing to have a minority of the minority absolutely try and handcuff a committee of the United States Senate. And I believe that is the wrong thing, because what is happening here sets a precedent for future answers. And there is no reason not to have a conference committee. I think the senator from Utah knows full well that these conference committees are open to the public, they're open to the press, they're often long, they can be laborious, but it's a way of reconciling the differences between the House and the Senate. So to handcuff this budget committee and say it can do this but it cannot do that is not the right thing to do. So I hope that the credibility of the minority running this body diminishes with this debate. So let me now go to an amendment Senator McCain and I introduced to eliminate taxpayer subsidies for tobacco production in the Farm Bill of America. It's number 923. I won't call it up because I understand an agreement is I'm just told by the chairman of the committee that I can call up the amendment, and to this end I would call up amendment number 923.
Is there objection? The clerk will report the amendment.
I ask the reading of the amendment be vitiated, and I will proceed with my remarks.
The clerk will simply report the amendment first.
Fine.
Senator from California, Mrs. Feinstein, proposes an amendment number 923.
Thank you very much.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the chairman. She made a commitment to hold a vote on this amendment on Monday evening, and she has sought mightily to keep her word, and I very much appreciate that. Madam President, this amendment is, to my view, about common sense. Tobacco is not just another crop. It causes 443,000 deaths each year. It is the leading cause of preventable death in America. The CDC estimates that tobacco costs the American economy more than $200 billion each year in health care expenses and lost productivity. A recent study estimates that annual smoking attributable expenditures add $22 billion each year to Medicaid's bottom line. In other words, Medicaid costs $22 billion more because of tobacco. In 2004, Congress approved nearly $10 billion, $9.6 billion to be exact, in payments over the next 10 years to tobacco farmers and quota holders in exchange for ending the tobacco program. In addition to this $10 billion, tobacco farmers also received more than $276 million in taxpayer-funded crop insurance subsidies since 2004. And that's what we are trying to change. Unlike crop insurance indemnities, the tobacco insurance subsidy is not based on losses. The government pays premium support subsidies year in, year out, regardless of losses. In 2012, farmers received $37.4 million in subsidies. In 11, $33 million. In 10, $37.1 million. In 2009, $40.1 million. If you add this up, there's $147 million in subsidies given despite the big tobacco buyout of $10 billion in subsidies to crop insurance. If you look at our $642 billion deficit, why would the government continue to subsidize crop insurance for tobacco? Now, that's not to say tobacco farmers shouldn't have access to crop insurance. Insurance is an important risk management tool for any business, and our amendment allows tobacco farmers to continue to purchase crop insurance. The amendment is specific. It eliminates the government's contribution to the annual cost of tobacco insurance premiums, but it does not impact the ability for crop insurance companies to sell these products. Farmers can manage weather and market risk without the mandatory taxpayer premium support. Now, some may say, well, market rate insurance isn't feasible for farmers. I challenge that notion. Carrot farmers don't have access to any crop insurance, federally subsidized or otherwise. Neither do spinach farmers, broccoli farmers, or artichoke farmers. The list of crops with no insurance support goes on. Cauliflower, celery, eggplant, cut flowers, kiwi, kumquats, melon, garlic, raspberries, and pomegranates, just to name a few. Farming without government-subsidized crop insurance is possible, contrary to what some would have you believe. And I also want to remind my colleagues that tobacco farmers have done quite well by the government. In 2014, North Carolina tobacco farmers and quota owners will have received $3.9 billion in buyout payments. In other words, they've taken this money to buy out, be bought out. Kentucky quota owners and farmers will have received $2.4 billion from the government. Quota holders and farmers in Tennessee, South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia will each have received more than $600 million in buyout payments by the end of next year. Evenly divided among the thousands of tobacco quota holders and farmers nationwide, the nearly $10 billion buyout has provided very generous support. Now, we need to remember this is not a struggling industry, contrary to what some would have you believe. A 2012 University of Illinois study found that productivity on Kentucky tobacco farms increased by 44% in the last 10 years. At the same time, tobacco farmers are seeing some of their best paydays since the 2004 buyout began. Tobacco is fetching nearly $2 a pound for some farmers, and the 2012 crop was valued at $1.579 billion. To return to the question at hand, should taxpayers continue to subsidize tobacco production? I believe the answer is no. Tobacco is the leading cause of preventable death in the United States. As I said, it kills 443,000 people each year. It costs $200 billion in health care and reduced productivity. I'm not alone. This amendment is supported by the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, the American Lung Association, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, the American Public Health Association, the Environmental Working Group, Doctors for America, and Physicians for Responsible Medicine, and Taxpayers for Common Sense. Now, some would have you believe, well, this is really going to affect the small tobacco farmer. Let's take a look at it. There are 16,228 farms that grow tobacco nationwide. Well, I won't get into that. The industry is concentrated. A small number of large farms produce the vast majority of the crop. 2% of the farms produce 50% of the annual tobacco crop. 10%, 75% of the annual tobacco crop. 20% of farms that grow tobacco are smaller than 50 acres. 80% of farms that grow tobacco are larger than 50 acres. The bottom line is that most tobacco farmers are not relying on tobacco as their primary crop. Thus, it's not surprising that only 4,495, that's 72% of farms, have tobacco sales of more than $50,000 a year. A fair assessment shows that about 5% of tobacco farmers, 908, do fall into the category of small farmers that rely on tobacco as their primary farm income. Now, the buyout expires, I believe, at the end of 2014. My point is nearly $10 billion of taxpayer funds are in the process of being expended to buy out tobacco farmers. Why should we then subsidize crop insurance? So I very much hope that my colleagues will join me in supporting what I think is common sense reform. We have to say no to tobacco in America. And I think most of us think that we've made really great progress. Young people smoke less, older people smoke less, you don't smoke in public places. All of these things have had a big impact. I think by eliminating this subsidy on crop insurance, it also can have a constructive impact. So I urge an aye vote, and I don't see anyone else on the floor willing to speak at this time, so I note, oh, I do. I see Senator Blumenthal, and I will yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank the senator from California for her excellent work on the amendment that she is offering, which takes to another level the fight against tobacco addiction that has so plagued this country. She has been such a champion of the victims of nicotine and tobacco addiction, and her work certainly has been a model for many of us who have been involved in this fight. I rise today to introduce the Military Crime Victims Act, Military Crime Victims' Rights Act of 2013. There are 26,000 victims of sexual assault in the military every year. At least last year there were that number estimated, but only a fraction, some 3,000 plus, were reported. This measure encourages more accurate and complete reporting of all crimes by guaranteeing all victims of crimes in the military the basic rights that victims have in civilian courts under current law. These rights are not a matter of discretion. They are legal rights that victims of crime in our federal courts enjoy. And my proposal is essentially to apply those same rights, guarantee them, in the military code of justice. The Uniform Code of Military Justice fails to afford these basic rights. They are rights of decency and fairness to crime victims. And it requires many of these victims to endure humiliating and insulting obstacles in their quest for justice. And so it naturally discourages them from coming forward and reporting these acts, most especially the acts of sexual assault. These rights that I believe should be applied under the code, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, are, for example, the right to protection from the accused, notice and opportunity to speak at trial, the right against unreasonable delay in trial proceedings. Those are just a few of the rights that would be guaranteed. They are standards of decency and fairness that are essential to effective prosecution and the goals of good order and discipline in the military. These fundamental rights are well established in the civilian courts and well esteemed by prosecutors and defendants as well as the victims, because they enable the justice system to function more fairly and effectively. Few would imagine going into a civilian court in a criminal trial without the statutory right to be protected from the accused, protected against physical threat or intimidation. Few would imagine going into a civilian court and being denied the right to appear and to speak when one's history, one's personal and sexual history, is an issue in the trial. Few would imagine the denial of a right to be heard in the course of sentencing. Few would imagine unreasonable delay and permission for the accused to actually leave the country and be unavailable for the trial, and thereby have that unreasonable delay. And yet, in the military courts, these events are routine and accepted. This bill would correct that failing. There's no reason that military sexual assault victims should be given less respect or fewer rights than civilian victims of the same offense. The key to deterring crime is prosecuting and punishing it effectively, which requires reporting by victims. More than reporting, it requires cooperation. We know for a fact that victims denied rights and respect will simply not report sexual assaults. In the military, they fear retaliation and discouragement of many kinds in reporting serious crimes of all kinds. If sexual assault isn't reported, it can't be prosecuted, and if it's not prosecuted, it certainly can't be punished or deterred. I became involved in this issue of victims' rights in the military because of a constituent who came forward to me, and I became involved in her case because she was denied basic justice. Her case was delayed. She was a victim of sexual assault in the apartment of an officer stationed in Rhode Island. She never had the opportunity to speak in court in a timely way. Her credibility was directly put at issue, and she had no opportunity to rebut, in effect, the charges brought against her. So often, the victim is the one on trial. So often, she or he is forced to relive that brutal, vicious, predatory act of criminal conduct, simply to bring charges and seek justice. And she is seeking justice, not only on her own behalf, but on behalf of the nation. Because the history, and it's clearly the experience that's proven by solid evidence, is that a sexual offender repeats that offense. The rate of recidivism is higher for sexual offenses than any other kind of crime. So last year, I requested that the Department of Defense investigate both their failure to afford victims the right to be heard during public proceedings and victims' rights to be free from unreasonable delay and the lack of remedies available to victims. The report that I received as a result of that request explained in February that the Department of Defense does not include the full list of crime victims' rights in its directive because it references a repealed statute, one from 1990, rather than the more recent one passed by Congress, the United States Justice for All Act of 2004. That's why still today, military service, our military service, each of them is operating on out-of-date and inadequate victim protection. The reason is not military necessity. It is simply ignoring the law that exists right now in spirit, if not in letter. My bill would correct the letter of the law to guarantee these rights. I appreciate the investigation conducted by the Department of Defense General Counsel Robert Taylor and the military's commitment to revising their out-of-date directives and instructions. But we need a statutory remedy now so that people whose rights are violated will have a remedy, so they will have a recourse and relief when their rights are violated. This Victims' Bill of Rights has proved feasible and effective in the civilian justice proceedings involving the very same offenses. The rights are not novel or untested. They are well established and esteemed. So I ask today for support from my colleagues in passing this measure. It's a basic common sense measure. It requires a military judge, just like their civilian counterparts, to take up and decide any motion asserting a victim's rights right away. It requires an ombudsman within the Department of Defense, just like the ombudsman for crime victims' rights in the Department of Justice. It requires training for judge advocates and other appropriate members of the armed forces and personnel of the department to assist them in responding more effectively to the needs of victims' rights. And it requires trial counsel in a military case to advise the victim that he or she can seek the advice of her own attorney with respect to these rights. We have an opportunity and an obligation to stand up for those who stand up for us and defend us, and I refuse to disappoint them. I look forward to working on enacting this proposal with my colleagues in the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Department of Defense, and the United States military. And I would welcome the views of the Response Systems Panel established by Congress when they have views that they wish to impart. We have the best and strongest military force in the history of the world, in the history of our nation. Our men and women in uniform deserve a military justice system worthy of their excellence. I thank you, and I yield the floor.
The senator from Michigan.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the time until 1 o'clock be equally divided between proponents and opponents of the Feinstein-McCain Amendment 923, and that following the confirmation vote this afternoon, that the resumption of legislative session, the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the amendment, that there be 2 minutes equally divided prior to the vote, and that the amendment be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, just one more comment. I see a colleague wishing to speak on the floor. I just want to thank everyone as we are working through the Farm Bill. We are making progress. We are moving forward and looking forward to continuing to put in place the final path to passage of the bill. Thank you.
May I speak after Toomey, or do you?
Madam President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Madam President, I rise to make a unanimous consent request. Thank you, Madam President. We've been following in the news a extraordinary horror story, and it's the story of Kermit Gosnell's really unspeakable crimes that were committed over a long period of time, maybe as much as 2 decades, at the Women's Medical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.